There exists within the realm of human psychology a hunting instinct so sophisticated, so precisely calibrated to detect vulnerability, that it operates beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, yet guides predatory personalities to their ideal victims with the accuracy of a heat-seeking missile. If you have ever wondered why narcissists seem to find you, why manipulative people appear in your life with disturbing regularity, why you attract those who exploit rather than celebrate your giving nature, the answer lies not in bad luck or coincidence, but in unconscious signals you are broadcasting that narcissists have learned to read like a perfectly written manual for exploitation. Jung understood what most people refuse to acknowledge, that narcissists are not random in their selection of victims, but extraordinarily skilled at identifying individuals whose psychological makeup, unhealed wounds and unconscious patterns make them perfect hosts for parasitic relationships. These predators possess what amounts to a sixth sense for detecting the specific combination of empathy, self-doubt, and boundary confusion that characterizes their ideal supply source. They can sense your vulnerability the way sharks sense blood in the water, not to offer help, but to exploit weakness. The unconscious signals begin with what I call wounded empathy broadcasts, the way unhealed empaths unconsciously communicate their capacity to absorb others' pain, their compulsion to fix what is broken, their willingness to sacrifice their own well-being for others' comfort. These signals are not conscious choices, but automatic transmissions from unintegrated trauma that creates a psychological signature narcissists recognize immediately. Your kindness, which should be your strength, becomes a beacon that draws those who have learned to weaponize compassion against its own source. Another powerful signal is what Jung would recognize as abandonment terror frequency, the unconscious fear of being left alone that emanates from those whose early attachment wounds have never healed. Narcissists can detect this frequency with predatory precision because they understand that someone who fears abandonment will tolerate incredible mistreatment rather than risk being alone. They sense your terror of rejection and position themselves as your rescue from loneliness, knowing that this rescue fantasy will make you complicit in your own exploitation. The narcissist also responds to what I call low self-worth resonance, the subtle but unmistakable vibration of someone who questions their own value, doubts their own perceptions, and believes on some level that they don't deserve genuine love and respect. This resonance is like a dog whistle to narcissistic personalities because they understand that someone with fragile self-worth will be grateful for any attention, even negative attention, and will work desperately to prove their worthiness rather than demanding to be treated well. Perhaps most tragically, narcissists are drawn to what I call helper identity signals, the unconscious communication that your sense of worth is tied to your usefulness, that your identity depends on being needed, that your purpose is to serve others' needs regardless of the cost to yourself. These signals attract narcissists like moths to flame, because they recognize that someone whose identity revolves around helping others will be unable to refuse their demands, unable to prioritize their own needs, unable to leave even when the relationship becomes obviously toxic. The predator also detects what Jung called projection vulnerability, the tendency to see good where none exists, to make excuses for others' harmful behavior, to believe that everyone possesses the same basic humanity and good intentions that you possess. This psychological blind spot makes you incapable of recognizing predatory behavior for what it is, allowing narcissists to present themselves as wounded souls in need of understanding rather than predators in search of supply. Another signal narcissists recognize is boundary permeability, the unconscious communication that your limits are negotiable, your standards are flexible, your needs are optional. This permeability often stems from childhood experiences where boundaries were consistently violated or where you learned that maintaining boundaries led to punishment or rejection. Narcissists sense this permeability and understand that they can gradually erode your limits until you have none left. The most devastating signal is what I call trauma bonding readiness, the unconscious pattern of mistaking intensity for intimacy, chaos for passion, manipulation for love. If your early relationships taught you that love includes a certain amount of harm, that care involves some degree of control, that connection requires a sacrifice of self, then you unknowingly broadcast your readiness to enter trauma bonds that narcissists specialize in creating and maintaining. These signals combine to create what amounts to a psychological profile that narcissists can read instantly upon meeting you. They recognize in your body language, your speech patterns, your responses to their initial tests, whether you are someone who will supply them with the admiration, control, and emotional labor they require while asking for very little in return. What makes narcissists so devastatingly effective in their victim selection is not intuition, but methodology. They have developed what amounts to an unconscious assessment protocol that allows them to evaluate potential targets within minutes of first contact, determining with remarkable accuracy whether someone possesses the psychological vulnerabilities they require for successful exploitation. This assessment process is so refined, so systematically thorough, that most targets never realize they are being evaluated, tested, and catalogued for their potential usefulness as narcissistic supply sources. The initial assessment begins with what I call empathy testing, subtle probes designed to measure your capacity for absorbing others' emotions, your willingness to prioritize others' comfort over your own, your tendency to make excuses for behavior that should be unacceptable. The narcissist might share a dramatic story designed to trigger your rescue instincts, present themselves as misunderstood or mistreated, or create a minor crisis to see how quickly you spring into helpful action. Your response tells them everything they need to know about your empathic vulnerability and your potential as an emotional supply source. They also conduct what I call boundary probing, small violations designed to test your limits, your willingness to speak up for yourself, your capacity to maintain your own standards when pressured. This might involve showing up late without apology, making inappropriate comments to gauge your reaction, asking for small favors to see how easily you comply, or pushing against your stated preferences to determine how flexible your boundaries actually are. Each boundary violation that goes unchallenged teaches them exactly how much they can take from you without consequence. Perhaps most insidiously, narcissists perform self-worth assessment. Carefully calibrated interactions designed to measure your confidence level, your sense of personal value, your belief in your own worth and deservingness. They pay attention to how you respond to compliments, whether you deflect praise or accept it gracefully, how much validation you seem to need, how quickly you apologize for things that aren't your fault. Low self-worth is like gold to a narcissist because it indicates someone who will be grateful for their attention and unlikely to demand better treatment. The narcissist also conducts isolation potential evaluation, determining how connected you are to supportive relationships, how strong your support network is, how likely others are to interfere with their access to you. They probe for information about your family relationships, your friendships, your support systems, looking for signs that you are already somewhat isolated or that you can be gradually separated from those who might recognize their manipulative behavior and warn you against it. Another crucial component is what Jung would recognize as trauma signature detection, the narcissist's ability to identify your specific wounds, your unhealed areas, your emotional trigger points. They listen carefully to what you share about your past, your family, your previous relationships, cataloging information they can later use to manipulate your emotions, trigger your insecurities, or position themselves as the healing you've been seeking. Your trauma becomes their roadmap for exploitation. The assessment also includes resource evaluation, determining what you can provide beyond emotional supply. This includes your financial resources, your social connections, your professional abilities, your physical attractiveness, your domestic skills, your willingness to provide services that benefit them. The narcissist is essentially conducting a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether the effort required to manipulate you will yield sufficient return on their investment. Perhaps most chillingly, they perform exit barrier assessment, evaluating how difficult it would be for you to leave once they have established control. They look for signs of trauma bonding readiness, financial dependence potential, social isolation vulnerability, low self-esteem that would make you unlikely to believe you deserve better treatment. The harder they determine it would be for you to leave, the more attractive you become as a target. The narcissist also tests for what I call reality distortion susceptibility, your tendency to doubt your own perceptions when they conflict with others' assertions, your willingness to accept alternative explanations for clearly problematic behavior, your capacity to be gaslit into questioning your own sanity. They might make obviously false statements to see if you'll challenge them, contradict things they said earlier to test your memory and confidence, or present clearly unreasonable requests as perfectly normal to gauge your reality testing abilities. This entire assessment process typically occurs within the first few interactions, often disguised as getting to know you, showing interest in your life, or demonstrating their own vulnerability and trustworthiness. By the time you realize you've been evaluated and selected, the narcissist has already gathered enough information to begin the systematic process of exploitation that will characterize the relationship going forward. Jung's most profound insight into narcissistic targeting lies in his understanding that certain archetypal patterns, when unconsciously activated and unintegrated, create psychological configurations that make individuals irresistibly attractive to predatory personalities. These are not personal flaws, but universal human patterns that, when operating without conscious awareness, become vulnerabilities that narcissists have learned to exploit with devastating precision. Understanding these archetypal patterns is crucial because they operate at a level deeper than personality, deeper than conscious choice, in the realm where unconscious psychological forces shape our relationships and determine our susceptibility to manipulation. The most common archetypal vulnerability is what Jung called the wounded healer, individuals whose own unresolved trauma has created a compulsive need to save others from similar pain. These individuals are particularly attractive to narcissists because their helper identity makes them incapable of refusing requests for aid. Their trauma history makes them susceptible to manipulation through familiar pain patterns, and their focus on others' healing allows them to avoid confronting their own unprocessed wounds. The narcissist recognizes this pattern and positions themselves as the ultimate wounded soul in need of the healing that only this particular helper can provide. Another powerful vulnerability is the eternal child archetype, individuals who never fully individuated from their family of origin and remain unconsciously seeking the parental approval, protection, or love they never received. These individuals are attracted to narcissists who initially present themselves as powerful, confident, successful figures who seem capable of providing the security and validation they crave. The narcissist recognizes this childlike need and alternates between playing the protective parent and the disapproving authority figure, keeping their target in a constant state of seeking approval that never fully arrives. The martyr complex represents another archetypal vulnerability that narcissists exploit masterfully. Individuals possessed by this archetype have organized their identity around sacrifice, suffering, and selfless service to others. They unconsciously believe that their worth is measured by how much they can endure, how much they can give, how much they can sacrifice for others' benefit. Narcissists recognize this pattern and provide endless opportunities for martyrdom, creating situations where their target can suffer beautifully while the narcissist benefits from their sacrifice. Perhaps most tragically vulnerable is the innocent archetype, individuals who maintain an unconscious belief in fundamental human goodness, who cannot conceive of genuine evil or calculate cruelty, who consistently give others the benefit of the doubt even when evidence suggests otherwise. This innocence, while beautiful, creates a form of psychological blindness that makes it impossible to recognize predatory behavior for what it is. The narcissist exploits this innocence by presenting themselves as fellow innocents who have been misunderstood or mistreated, triggering the innocent's natural desire to defend and protect. The rescuer archetype creates another form of vulnerability that narcissists target specifically. These individuals are unconsciously driven to save others from their problems, their pain, their dysfunction, their consequences. They cannot tolerate seeing others suffer and will sacrifice their own well-being to alleviate others' distress. Narcissists recognize this pattern and present themselves as drowning souls in need of rescue, knowing that the rescuer will throw them lifeline after lifeline while gradually drowning themselves in the process. Jung also identified the people-pleaser archetype as particularly vulnerable to narcissistic exploitation. These individuals have organized their psychology around gaining approval, avoiding conflict, and ensuring that others are comfortable and happy. They have learned to suppress their own needs, opinions, and desires in service of maintaining harmony and acceptance. Narcissists target these individuals because they know they will receive minimal resistance to their demands, maximum compliance with their expectations, and constant efforts to keep them satisfied regardless of the cost. The perfectionist archetype creates vulnerability through its inability to tolerate making mistakes, appearing flawed, or falling short of impossible standards. Narcissists exploit this by setting up scenarios where their target inevitably fails to meet their expectations, then using this failure as evidence of the target's inadequacy and reason for the narcissist's disappointment or punishment. The perfectionist becomes trapped in an endless cycle of trying to prove their worth, while the narcissist maintains control through the impossibility of ever reaching their standards. Perhaps most insidiously, narcissists target what Jung called the shadow projector, individuals who consistently see in others what they cannot acknowledge in themselves. These individuals project their own goodness onto those who don't possess it, while projecting their own capacity for darkness onto innocent parties. Narcissists exploit this by allowing the projector to see them as the repository of all good qualities, while positioning others as the source of all problems, creating a dynamic where the narcissist can do no wrong and everyone else becomes suspect. What Jung understood about narcissistic targeting that makes it truly chilling is how these predators have developed an almost supernatural ability to detect and exploit what I call trauma signatures, the specific psychological imprints left by early wounds that create predictable patterns of vulnerability in adult relationships. Your unhealed trauma doesn't just affect how you see yourself, it broadcasts a signal into the psychological environment that narcissists have learned to recognize and exploit with surgical precision. They don't just find you by accident. They are drawn to the specific resonance of your particular wounds, like predators following a scent trail to wounded prey. The most powerful trauma signature is abandonment wounding, the deep terror of being left alone that stems from early experiences of abandonment, neglect, or conditional love. This wound creates adults who will tolerate incredible mistreatment rather than risk being alone, who interpret any threat of withdrawal as existential danger, who will sacrifice their own well-being to prevent abandonment. Narcissists recognize this signature immediately and use it as their primary control mechanism, alternating between threatening to leave and promising to stay, creating a psychological dependency that makes escape feel like death. Another potent signature is attachment trauma, wounds created by inconsistent, unpredictable, or dangerous early caregiving that left the individual with a confused understanding of love and safety. These individuals learn to associate love with uncertainty, care with control, and intimacy with danger. Narcissists exploit this by creating relationships that feel familiar in their chaos, intensity, and unpredictability. The very dysfunction that should repel these individuals instead feels like home because it matches their earliest templates for connection. The worthlessness wound creates perhaps the most tragic vulnerability. Individuals who learned early that they were not inherently valuable, that their worth was conditional on their performance, their compliance, their usefulness to others. This wound makes them grateful for any attention, even negative attention, and incapable of demanding better treatment because they unconsciously believe they don't deserve it. Narcissists target this wound by providing intermittent reinforcement, occasional praise mixed with consistent criticism, keeping their victims in a constant state of trying to prove their worthiness. Jung also recognized powerlessness trauma as a signature that narcissists exploit ruthlessly. This stems from early experiences of having no control, no voice, no ability to protect oneself from harm. Adults carrying this wound often feel helpless in the face of others' demands, unable to assert their own needs or boundaries, resigned to being controlled by stronger personalities. Narcissists recognize this learned helplessness and position themselves as the powerful figure that the powerless person both fears and desperately needs. The invisibility wound creates another tragic vulnerability. Individuals who learned that their thoughts, feelings, and needs didn't matter, that they were only valuable when serving others' purposes. These individuals struggle to believe that anyone could be genuinely interested in them for their own sake, making them susceptible to narcissists who initially shower them with attention before gradually returning them to their familiar state of invisibility, except when needed for narcissistic supply. Perhaps most insidiously, narcissists target what Jung called parentification trauma, individuals who were forced to become caregivers for their own parents or family systems, who learned that their role was to manage others' emotions, solve others' problems, and sacrifice their own childhood for others' needs. These individuals carry forward a compulsive need to fix, heal, and rescue others, making them perfect targets for narcissists who present themselves as broken souls in need of exactly the kind of caretaking these individuals are compelled to provide. The perfectionism wound stems from early experiences where love and acceptance were conditional on flawless performance, where mistakes were met with rejection or punishment, where the child learned that being human was dangerous. Adults with this wound are attracted to narcissists who initially seem to appreciate their perfection, but then gradually reveal impossible standards that can never be met, recreating the familiar dynamic of trying to earn love through perfect performance while never quite succeeding. Narcissists also exploit loyalty trauma, wounds created by betrayal, abandonment, or broken promises that left the individual with a desperate need to prove their own loyalty and trustworthiness. These individuals will endure incredible betrayals while remaining faithful, will sacrifice their own needs to demonstrate their commitment, will stay in harmful relationships to prove they are not like those who abandoned them. Narcissists recognize this pattern and exploit it by positioning themselves as worthy of the ultimate loyalty test. The most devastating aspect of trauma signature exploitation is how narcissists use your own healing attempts against you. They study your self-help books, your therapy insights, your spiritual practices, and learn to speak your language of growth and healing while using these very concepts to deepen your trauma bonds and justify their continued exploitation of your wounds. We arrive now at the most crucial transformation in the journey away from narcissistic targeting, the development of what Jung would call psychological sovereignty, a state of inner authority and self-knowledge so complete that you no longer broadcast the vulnerability signals that draw predatory personalities into your orbit. This is not about becoming cold, closed, or defensive, but about healing the wounds that made you visible to predators in the first place, integrating the shadows that created your blind spots, and developing the kind of wholeness that naturally repels those who seek to exploit rather than celebrate human complexity. Breaking the signal begins with what I call trauma signature healing, the conscious work of identifying and resolving the specific wounds that have been broadcasting your availability for exploitation. This means facing the abandonment terror that made you tolerate mistreatment rather than risk being alone. It means healing the worthlessness wound that made you grateful for any attention, even harmful attention. It means resolving the powerlessness trauma that made you unable to assert boundaries or advocate for your own needs. Each healed wound removes a beacon that drew narcissists to your psychological door. The process requires what Jung called shadow integration, acknowledging and reclaiming the parts of yourself that you rejected, feared, or deemed unacceptable. When you own your capacity for anger, you stop attracting those who exploit your excessive niceness. When you integrate your own selfishness, you stop being drawn to those who take advantage of your compulsive giving. When you accept your own imperfections, you stop seeking validation from those who use your perfectionism against you. Shadow integration makes you less susceptible to manipulation because you no longer need others to carry the parts of yourself you cannot face. Perhaps most importantly, becoming unselectable requires developing what I call predator literacy, the ability to recognize the subtle signs of exploitative intention before they have time to establish psychological hooks. This means learning to identify love bombing as manipulation rather than romance, recognizing boundary testing as predatory behavior rather than playful teasing, seeing emotional manipulation as exploitation rather than passionate connection. Predator literacy develops through studying the patterns, trusting your instincts, and refusing to make excuses for behavior that feels wrong even when it's packaged attractively. The transformation also involves cultivating reciprocity consciousness, the expectation that healthy relationships involve mutual exchange, shared emotional labor, and balanced giving and receiving. When you develop clear standards for how you expect to be treated and the willingness to enforce those standards, regardless of consequences, you automatically filter out those who seek one-way extraction. Narcissists lose interest in targets who demand reciprocity because their entire relational strategy depends on finding people who will give without receiving equivalent value in return. Becoming unselectable requires what Jung understood as individuation, the process of becoming consciously yourself rather than unconsciously reactive to others' manipulations. This means knowing your own values independent of others' opinions, trusting your own perceptions regardless of others' gaslighting attempts, and maintaining your own emotional center even when others try to destabilize you. The individuated person cannot be easily manipulated because they have developed an internal authority that cannot be overridden by external pressure. The process also involves developing energetic boundaries, the ability to maintain your own emotional state regardless of others' attempts to trigger, provoke, or emotionally hijack you. This means learning to stay calm when others create drama, maintaining your peace when others manufacture crisis, and keeping your center when others try to pull you into their chaos. Narcissists lose interest in people they cannot emotionally destabilize because emotional reactivity is essential to their control strategies. Perhaps most powerfully, becoming unselectable requires embracing what I call comfortable aloneness, the capacity to be genuinely content with your own company, to find fulfillment in solitude, to choose relationships from desire rather than from desperate need. When you are truly comfortable being alone, you cannot be threatened with abandonment. When you enjoy your own company, you cannot be manipulated through loneliness. When you choose relationships from wholeness rather than emptiness, you attract only those who can match your level of emotional health. The ultimate protection comes from what Jung called self-love, not narcissistic self-obsession, but genuine appreciation for your own worth, respect for your own needs, and commitment to your own well-being. When you truly love yourself, you cannot tolerate being mistreated. When you respect yourself, you cannot accept disrespect from others. When you value yourself, you cannot be manipulated into accepting less than you deserve. The liberated person becomes what I call narcissist repellent, not because they are defensive or closed-hearted, but because they radiate the kind of self-possession, emotional stability, and healthy boundaries that narcissists cannot penetrate or exploit. They have healed the wounds that made them vulnerable, integrated the shadows that created their blind spots, and developed the wholeness that makes them uninteresting to predators who seek broken people to exploit. You were not chosen by accident, but you can become unchoosable by design. Your healing is your protection, your wholeness is your shield, your self-love is your immunity to those who mistake your kindness for weakness, your empathy for exploitation, your love for a license to harm. If you recognize yourself as someone narcissists seem to find repeatedly, if you see your own vulnerability patterns in these descriptions, then your protection begins with the most radical act of self-love you can commit, choosing to heal the wounds that have been broadcasting your availability for exploitation, not because you're broken, but because you deserve relationships that celebrate rather than exploit your beautiful qualities. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to develop the psychological sovereignty that makes you unselectable to predators while remaining open to genuine love. Share this video with someone else who needs to understand that they weren't chosen randomly. Their specific vulnerabilities were identified and targeted systematically. And most importantly, start today. Identify one trauma signature you recognize from this exploration. Maybe it's your terror of abandonment that makes you tolerate mistreatment, or your worthlessness wound that makes you grateful for any attention, or your helper identity that makes you unable to refuse demands. Make a commitment to begin healing this wound through therapy, inner work, or whatever path resonates with your healing journey. Your vulnerability patterns are not permanent. Your trauma signatures can be healed. Your unconscious signals can be transformed from available for exploitation to approach with respect or don't approach at all. Narcissists didn't choose you because you're weak. They chose you because you have beautiful qualities they learned to weaponize against you. Your empathy, your kindness, your loyalty, your dedication. These are gifts, not flaws. But they need protection through healthy boundaries, self-love, and the kind of wholeness that makes exploitation impossible. Stop being a magnet for predators and become a beacon for genuine love. Stop broadcasting vulnerability and start radiating strength. Stop being selectable for exploitation and become choosy about who gets access to your beautiful heart. You deserve love that honors rather than harms, relationships that build rather than break, connections that celebrate rather than exploit who you are.